Thank you very much. I'm going to take a risk and contradict Eldad a little bit and briefly introduce myself. First, I'd just like to apologize to our keynote speaker this morning for missing the presentation. I regret that, but we have a video document that I'll be watching at the lunch break. I guess I just want to introduce myself and explain how I became involved in this conference. I'm on the faculty of in the Faculty of Fine Arts here. Sorry, let's get this into work. In the Film Animation program in the School of Cinema. And my background is in music as well as in film animation. But although I've sort of been involved in music in a wide range of styles and genres, on the animation side I'm pretty much a classical animation guy, or to use that dirty word, cartoons. And I found myself a few years ago taking inspiration from Christopher Hinton, who is a local animation filmmaker that you may be familiar with, who regretfully has retired from our school, but he's still around. And he went through a transitional period where he also sort of became disenchanted with the conventions of cartoons and started exploring this thing that people refer to as visual music. So somehow my colleague, Professor Ricardo Belfarra, caught wind of me being here down the street and being interested in this, so he asked me to take part along with Eldad in helping run part of this conference. And for me it was a great honor to receive so many applications for the so-called fixed media works that we're going to be showing throughout the conference. So I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to speak to you today. I guess the focus of this paper in the spirit of this conference is to understand. My own research is in the beginning stages, I would have to say, of visual music. So I will endeavor to present what I understand to be visual music, where it comes from, and why it holds such a fascination that we could all be drawn here together to discuss it and define it, maybe, and most importantly, to develop it and see where it goes in the future. And the title, Silent and Still, as you will see, sort of refers to something specific, but I've decided to attempt to illustrate my talk with only silent stills, so we'll see how that goes. So this is visual music, or this is what the art critic Roger Fry wrote upon reviewing 3 Kandinsky paintings in 1913, 2 of which were improvisations, such as this one of which was a landscape at the Royal Albert Hall in 1913 in London. And I quote the review that he published. As one contemplates the 3, referring to the 3 paintings, one finds that after a time the improvisations become more definite, more logical, and closely knit in structure, more exact in their equilibrium. They are pure visual music. But I cannot any longer doubt the possibility of emotional expression by such abstract visual signs. So Fry was one of the earliest champions of Kandinsky, and in particular he championed the artist's move away from the conventions of the Western European pictorial art canon of the day and pushed for the move towards the non-objective. And we now know that Kandinsky and his Blue Rider group had begun a movement which was founded in beliefs concerning the spiritual significance of colors, the necessity for extemporaneous approach to image making, and the importance of linking visual art and music. I won't go into much of an aside, but in reading Kandinsky's writings, it's amazing the depth to which he explored phenomenology of music and tried to find an equivalent for it in his visual work. Earlier uses of this term visual music have been very difficult to find, so I think this is why Fry is often credited as the originator of the term visual music. To me, what is striking about Fry's comment is that it validates the significance of Kandinsky not in terms of the political or conceptual rejection of traditional representational art, but more in terms of the emotional import of abstraction. And also, I find it intriguing to think that the term we use today to describe contemporary electronic, audio, visual, animated experiences, or VJing, it actually comes from a description of something that is so silent and so still. While strikingly modern in relation to many of his contemporaries, Kandinsky's appeal as a painter is not immediate to every viewer, and I have to admit I took a little bit of time to start to appreciate his visual work, and I like the stuff, I think, from the late 30s the best. But as a writer on art, I think his depth is undeniable. He's best known for Concerning the Spiritual in Art, and however, it's an excerpt from a smaller volume entitled Point and Line to Plane that is interesting to me in terms of understanding the relationship between the optical and the auditory. And this is taken directly from Point and Line to Plane. If you've been to art school, you've probably seen this a few times. And in this book, Kandinsky explains that the geometric point, or the period as it would be known in linguistic terms, resembles a knot, or a nothingness. The period or point is important in the context of writing because, as Kandinsky says, it belongs to speech and it indicates silence. So as we read the top line, we hear the words in our imagination. And I was told that the original was actually in German, so it would have sounded slightly different. In the variations in the lines below, the changing position of that point changes the emphasis of the linguistic components. Subject takes on more or less significance, but the point itself does not yet hold much significance as a sound, per se. Then we read the next example. And when our eyes come to rest on that point, at least for me, I hear something. The text that we've been looking at makes sounds in our imagination. We hear words, but the period now makes us hear silence. It is a simple yet profound phenomenon, and as music education researcher Edwin Gordon wrote years later, in the 70s, if I'm not mistaken, audiation, as he called it, is central not only to language, but to our system of understanding music. Now we read only the point. Its silence is completely dominating the auditory space in our imaginations, once filled with words. Is this visual music? Perhaps not in the way that Kandinsky's painting was, but it is definitely visual silence. And it opens the possibility of visual music as a concrete phenomenological experience. As John Cage famously demonstrated, it is silence that makes noise and, by extension, music a possibility. Now I'm going to start jumping around a bit, so I hope I don't lose you. With the advent of motion picture technology, we see new forms of visual music emerge. Still silent, but no longer still, is Fishinger's Radiodynamics from 1946. In this work, Fishinger triumphs in an attempt to bring the musical concepts of rhythm, harmony, and dissonance to the moving image. Geometric shapes, purely abstract, areas of color are animated across the screen in varying rhythmic bursts. In spite of its contemporary classification as visual music, radiodynamics was not music, at least that is what these titles of Fishinger's seem to indicate. But more seriously, the placement of this film in a cinema historical context makes its auditory silence significant. In 1942, synchronized sound, as we know, in cinema was well established. So his insistence on no music accompanying the visuals ties the piece, I believe, more closely to Kandinsky's approach to musical painting than it does to contemporary films of the day, which were synchronized for the most part to classical music recordings. So returning to this geometric point or period, the visual silence that Kandinsky refers to, this is a still image from James Whitney's 1966 film, Lapis. One of my favorite visual music masterpieces, and I think this continues the development of silent but kinetic visual music. And in researching this, this was surprising to me, but maybe not to some of you, that we normally hear this accompanied with a raga, Indian raga recording. But William Moritz explained in his writing in 1977 that the raga track was added to Lapis after it had already been in distribution as a silent film, at the behest of James Whitney's distributor, Bob Pike of the Creative Film Society. I find it somewhat ironic that the head of the Creative Film Society felt more comfortable having music with the picture. Again, the original musical score was blended to form a satisfactory accompaniment to the images, and it's re-released in the sound version, coincidentally just before the Beatles-inspired vogue for Indian music, helped contribute to Lapis becoming the most widely known and admired of any abstract film. However, as any silent viewing will show, perception of the visual meaning of the film can be actually enhanced without the music, and James plans in the near future to withdraw the current version and reissue the film either with a sound prepared specifically for it or as a silent film. And I haven't been successful in following up on that quote to see if that ever did happen. I'd be curious to see it if anyone knows. For me, the strength of this film confounds our modern conception of visual music if we think of visual music as an exclusively audio-visual experience. But once again, it helps to reinforce the lineage back to Kandinsky through Fischinger if we appreciate it according to Whitney's original methodological intentions. And Moritz's diligence in illuminating the history of this piece indicates the occasional marginalization of works that do not manifest music through auditory means. This leads to one additional piece that I think illustrates Kandinsky's point about visual silence, the geometric point of visual silence, with a kinetic experience. But in this case, the film is with sound. The young filmmaker Max Hattler recently presented this. This piece is called Sync from 2010. And my understanding is it was originally intended as an installation to be projected on the floor with a quadraphonic sound system. In this piece, Hattler explores the phi effect, an optical phenomenon that causes the viewer to perceive still images in sequence as movement, which is commonly confused with the idea of the persistence of vision. And it's a mesmerizing piece. It's absolutely magnificent. We will see concentric dots appear. They rotate around a circular array of turning lines. At the center of the image, we see Kandinsky's geometric point of visual silence. The optics are accompanied by a strong soundtrack built on varying iterations of the Overtone series. But as with Whitney's Lapis, Sync works also as a silent kinetic visual piece, and this is just my opinion now, calling into question the definition of what makes a work of visual music reflective of musical phenomenon, and questioning whether it is possible to define on an aesthetic level the attributes of visual music. And now, due to a complication that I won't go into, I think what I wanted to talk a little bit was the notion that before William Moritz passed away, he wrote a piece called Towards an Aesthetic of Visual Music, which I go back to frequently, and I think about a lot as far as how we can sort of reconcile all these different forms of media. And as an animator, I find this quote kind of funny, but I don't mean it in a disrespectful way. But I don't know, you might get a chuckle out of it as well. And Moritz said, this was in 1986, keep in mind, traditional animation has produced the most successful visual music compositions. Can't argue with that. But as we all know, 24 frames per second handcraft is a pretty tedious business. So the dream of a magic labor-saving device tempts many animators into wasting time fooling around with machines that can usually, at their best, produce merely shoddy work. Computers and lasers and video are hardly a panacea for most artists. computer time remains prohibitively expensive in 1986. Manipulation of many graphics programs can be just as awkward and time-consuming as traditional animation. Okay, that's true. And the nature of the visual product is most often severely limited, so that one can hardly keep a 5-minute stretch interesting. The computer artist, in quotes, furthermore, usually has to refurbish the raw imagery by traditional film and traditional animation processes, and still the finished product is often more of a syndrome than a piece of visual music. A particular style of pattern appears and does its thing repetitively for 5 or 10 minutes, often accompanied by attractive music, and then stops for no particular reason. And this scathing description of visual music can be found on, I believe it's on the IOTA Center's website, a fantastic resource. And then, on a little more serious note, I find this particularly salient. He says, remember, no machinery can offer you a sense of graphic design, a sensitivity to color, or a sensibility for choreography and timing. These skills can best be learned by practicing and studying traditional hand animation, just as an auditory music composer must learn the rudiments of harmony, counterpoint, melody, and structure by playing scales and chord progressions on the piano and other instruments before setting out to compose a symphony. Now, I never had the opportunity to meet William Moritz, but I wonder what he would think of what we were going to be presenting at this conference today. How are we doing for time? Okay. I will have to extemporaneous time. Okay. A few other things that I wanted to just sort of put up on the screen with the question, is this visual music? For those of you who are familiar with the technical side of film, this is a close-up of variable density optical soundtrack, which is this visual waveform that we see in the middle here. And there's a fantastic article by Levinson, I'm forgetting his first name, in the New Media, Old Media anthology that just came out a couple of years ago. And he has a great article in there called Tones from Nowhere. And it's all about the origins of this technological process. And apparently at the time when it was being researched in laboratories, there were hand-drawn animators hired to try to, by hand, redraw these graphic forms in the race to create the first synthetic human voice. They would have drawn some dialogue that had never actually passed through the lips of a human being. Now, if you translate that into redrawing musical waveforms, are we talking about visual music, or are we talking about music that has been visualized? And I think it's an important distinction, because Feniger's films are almost always called visual music, when in fact he was drawing waveforms that would be converted to music through the optical process. Another thing that I thought I would just throw up there, this is a film still from Synchrony, using the exact same process, but in this film, McLaren has photographed rather than drawn on the optical track. He's photographed these graphic shapes, and this is a little bit of optical printer magic. Each one of these is a single optical track, and it has been processed and reprinted across the surface of the image so that it is aesthetically pleasing to the eye. But on a more interesting level, what you see is literally what you hear, and it's perhaps the purest form of cinema in the sense that very few other films have done this. What you see is what you hear quite so successfully. So that led me to wonder, must the visuals be non-objective and the music concrète in order for the piece to be visual music? If abstraction is at the root, well, cartoons are abstractions, they're drawings. We associate all sorts of feelings and ideas with them, but they're an abstraction. And through synkresis, which is Chion's expression explaining the experience that occurs in our mental processes when sound and image occur at the same time, would this not be visual music? I'm familiar with the song. It's In and Out the Window, and in perfect rhythmic synchronization to that song, na 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 na. Poor Bimbo has to keep pedaling the bike forever with these gloves smacking him on the behind, in what I think is a great piece of visual music. And this is a bit of a stretch now, but if you're familiar with this classic from 1950, Gerald Boing Boing, very brief in a nutshell. He has a terrible speech impediment that allows him to make only sound effects, but his salvation comes at the end of the film when he's hired by XYZ, to do live sound, live Foley as it were, for radio plays. And at the very end here, he has to do the closing music because the orchestra is not in the studio, and out of his mouth magically appears, or is sonified, a wonderful orchestral recording. Without the soundtrack, looking at the still, I am hearing this music, and I wonder if that's maybe not visual music in a more literal sense. And last one, just to sort of throw it up there, is Cy Twombly, who recently passed away. And it's gestural. It, to me, suggests the movement of a conductor giving time to the orchestra. As it turns out, he was actually on the shoulders of his assistant, who ran back and forth across the studio while Twombly waved his arm. I'm not sure if there's something to it that could be visual. So, 2 minutes, thank you. I'll wrap up. So, how do we reconcile all these disparate forms of art / music / cinema / audiovisual experience when there is, on one hand, the history of fixed Western abstract painting and the silent tradition of such things as color organs, which I will skip for now, and on the other hand, non-objective cinema, electroacoustic music, and their contemporary descendant, live electronic audiovisual performance. You can see it becomes difficult to classify all of these long words, and it's maybe convenient to say visual music. However, I think the commonalities, evaluation, and critique of the aesthetics in all of these forms must be considered, as Moritz suggests. Maybe not quite as harshly, but what unites them might be more important than what separates them. Perhaps these distinct art forms ought to be celebrated as a collective means of self-expression, all of which are rooted in the belief that music is the purest form of emotion. In this way, it is neither the medium nor the form that defines a work as visual music. It is the methodology and spiritual underpinnings upon which it is built. So returning to the purpose of our conference this weekend, and as we appreciate the latest works and performances of visual music, it is apt, I think, to go back to 1913 and consider a romantic notion as well as a caution concerning the non-objective art left for us by Kandinsky in his more poetic writing, Reminiscence. First, the caution. He asks, what is to replace the missing object? The danger of ornament revealed itself clearly to me. The dead semblance of stylized forms I found merely repugnant. Only after many years of patient toil and strenuous thought, numerous painstaking attempts, and my constantly developing ability to conceive of pictorial forms in purely abstract terms, engrossing myself more and more in these measureless depths, did I arrive at the pictorial forms that I use today. It sounds like it's a lot of work. And then Kandinsky's poetic, more romantic notion, which I feel applies as much to music as it does to the visual. He said, I consider it equally logical that cancelling out the object in painting makes very considerable demands of one's ability inwardly to experience purely pictorial form, so that the spectator's development in this direction is absolutely essential. The spectator's development is absolutely essential and can on no account be avoided. This is the way to create the conditions that constitute a new atmosphere. In this atmosphere, although much, much later, perhaps today, pure art will be formed. An art today that hovers between our eyes with indescribable allure in dreams that slip between our fingers. Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions.
Very quick.
Brian?
Kandinsky, back in 1910, 1911, 1912, when he was writing Spiritual Art in the Blue Rider Group, he was working, one of the composers he worked heavily with was Arnold Schoenberg.
Yes.
And so much of his understanding of music I think would come from sort of Schoenberg's sort of ideas at the time. And Schoenberg at that very same time was also trying to free music from a tonal base, just as Kandinsky was trying to free images from representation. I don't know if you comment on or have considered that, but there's this real interesting sort of parallel
Yeah, definitely. I would agree with that. I mean, I think it's Kandinsky that said that music is the great teacher. And I think when he referred to music in this way, there was maybe a sense of envy that what Schoenberg and other musical contemporaries were doing had this direct, visceral, emotional possibility that he was trying to get through visuals alone. But I think today the question is more about those two elements put together in what we call visual music today. That separation doesn't really exist anymore. I mean, part of the reason why I was interested in all these things is because it seems like people don't do silent visual music anymore for the most part. It's always audio-visual. But I think at that time, working with or collaborating with someone like Schoenberg, it must have been a pretty exciting experience.
So for Schoenberg was actually trying to sort of move music away from that romantic, emotional, expressive kind of thing into something a little more austere and pure.
But Kandinsky was trying to move away from conventional representation so that he could evoke nothing but pure emotion. So it's kind of this weird, never-ending cycle. They were, I don't know, they were at odds maybe, but at the same time they were working towards the same ultimate goal. It's interesting to ponder.
Does Dan Brackage have a place in your discussion of silent visual music? I'm just thinking you're saying it's not a current thing. He was making silent works into the 90s at least.
That's true, and a very good example. I mean, it was difficult to do a survey. It's going to be inadequate no matter what in a forum this short, but definitely as far as silent, so-called silent visual music, I think he holds a very significant place. There's an interesting question about objective versus non-objective, or I'm thinking of moth-light and things like that. But yeah, he's important.
So one more question. Todd, you want to do that?
Oh, sure. It's a little bit opposite, but to your subject. But I'm thinking a few years ago in Toronto, I went to a lecture by a Canadian animator who might be in his early 50s by now, and his thing was to draw objects onto the optical track. And so his movies were audio movies, and he had a whole repertoire, but I can't remember this person's name.
Might have been Pierre Hubert. I don't know age-wise, but
Richard
Reeves. Was it Richard Reeves? Oh yeah, in Toronto, that's right.
So that's him.
Yeah, he's actually published a little sort of how-to for student animators. But yeah, that's actually what I'm working on right now too. I sort of feel like I'm reinventing the wheel a bit, but it's kind of interesting that it's come around. It's much easier to work with rhythm than pitch when you're doing this technique.
Yes, yes.
And since music, popular music these days for the most part is a little bit more on the rhythmic side than on the harmonic side, I find it's cool again. At a very superficial level. But it's a fascinating process to sort of, in minute detail, make these etchings for hours and hours, and then put it onto a projector, and a piece of music comes out of it, no picture.
Exactly, yes.
I've got one I can show you after.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.